Well, welcome back to the Azure podcast. This is episode number 477, being recorded on the 1st of November, 2023, with special guests Ian Jensen and Michael Litman. I'm Sujit, and on Teams with me, we have, of course, our two special guests who we're going to get to in just a minute. But before that, let's just cover a few updates that happened this past week, or actually past couple of weeks since we did the last show. We didn't do a show last week, and there's four of them that were brought up by the team. One of them is for Azure Redis Cache. So if you use Redis Cache and you're kind of, as a developer, you're using it, you want to be able to see what kind of new versions of Redis Cache are coming up. So there's a way you could opt in to get like the channel updates for the upcoming releases of Redis Cache, and you can do that on your dev machine. So that this way you can preview what's coming before you roll it out into production. And so they have that available for all the caches, the basic, standard, and the premium caches. So you can kind of select your update channel there. The other update is with Azure Site Recovery. That service now will use Azure Monitor to raise certain alerts. And this way, you could see if there's something going wrong with the ASR, and then you could get notified to set up do something based on the alerts. Third update I have for you is with Azure Bastion, which is a service that I use a lot. And typically, when you deploy Azure Bastion, there's a SKU that you have to pick. I think that's like standard or premium, I forget what it is. But now they have a more cost-effective developer SKU. So there's less reasons to not use Azure Bastion. And I do recommend that if you are going to host a VM out there, you certainly use something like Azure Bastion to front-end it and keep it secure. You have those secure RDP and SSH sessions available to you. And finally, the WAF, or the if you use WAF with Application Gateway, now when you create a new instance, there's a default rule set 2.1 that's added to your setup. And the reason for that is they want to make sure that all the CVEs that Microsoft is constantly trying to track down are surfaced up through that rule set, right? So you automatically get all the new CVEs enforced for you, and this way it gives you an additional level of protection by default. Of course, you can go and turn it off if you think you don't need it, but that's the new default rule set now. The default rule set 2.1, which includes the OWASP and the CVEs, all of the kind of rules that they have to make your website more secure. So those are all the updates that we have today from the last couple of weeks. At this point, I'd like to turn the mic over to our special guests, Ian and Michael. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please go ahead and give us an introduction on what your backgrounds are in Azure, what you do, and most especially what your passion is in the Azure space.
Yeah, I'll go first. My name is Ian Jensen. I am a business applications SME in Microsoft's industry solutions engineering team. My background is primarily in ERP development within kind of the Microsoft ether. I think probably the thing I'm most passionate about in the Azure space is what we're talking about here today, this whole suite of kind of first-party systems that have been built on Azure for our enterprise customers. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I'll throw it to Michael.
So I'm Michael Litman. I'm also a biz app SME with Ian. And my passion has been for many years Dynamics 365 and subsequently the Power Platform. So I go back into the Dynamics world back to version 4 when it was all on-prem, and now we've moved out into the cloud, and that's spurred my passion further.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I remember when Ian initially reached out to me. I think we met recently at the hackathon in the Microsoft hackathon was in Redmond. Yes, and it was nice to meet Ian in person. I don't think we had met before.
I agree. It was awesome.
Michael, you were also there, I believe. Yes. Yeah, I remember you were sitting at the table with Matt and others. So, one of the things that he pitched, the idea he pitched to me was, this is the notion of a cloud within a cloud in Azure, right? So we all know what Azure is, but then we often forget that there's other clouds that run on Azure, right? Obviously, things like, the Office 365 suite, I suppose is one of them, but then there's these other clouds which are more application focused, more developer focused that we can leverage. And I just wanted to hear from you what your thoughts are, like how, and I believe that's where you guys sit a lot, is like working with these kind of cloud within a cloud options in Azure. So let's hear from you as to what are the main sub clouds, so to speak, that we should be talking about here today.
Yeah. So there's a whole. I'm probably gonna say ether a lot on this episode. I'm realizing it's like one of my favorite words. So there's this whole, let's call it an ecosystem of biz apps that are all kind of Azure first now as of 2023. They all kind of fall at Microsoft under the umbrella of Power Platform. So that's kind of the whole bubble. But there's specific subsets of applications within that group. So there's Power Apps. Those are kind of simple graphical applications that streamline business tasks. Power Automate, which is a workflow automation tool. Power BI for reporting. Power Virtual Agents for chatbots. And Power Pages for websites. That's kind of the core Power Platform tools. Under that umbrella, there's also, and this is kind of more Michael in my background, there's also a whole group of what we call the Dynamics 365 applications. And those are kind of, you can think of them as kind of carve out of business processes. So like my background is D365 Finance, which is an enterprise resource planning system, similar to like SAP, Oracle. Michael's background is more on the D365 sales CE side, which is more CRM products, customer relationship management products. So whole bunch of, and everything I'm talking about here, low code centric systems that have over many years been migrated to kind of Azure first architecture.
Yes. So what I'm hearing is that you have these SaaS application systems like the D365 branded suite of application systems, and then you have application platforms almost, right, in terms of the Power Platform. I like to think of is that the way to think of Power Platform? It's an application platform where you can put your own applications on there, versus D365, which is okay. Here is like a system, a ready-made system that's put to your SaaS product, and then you can kind of customize it and use it based on your business needs.
Yeah, I think that's a fair and important delineation. Yeah, the Power Platform tools are kind of greenfield. I mean, so I should, with a big caveat that some of the systems we talked about, like D365 Sales, use a lot of the Power Platform dev tools to like customize and manage these systems. But yes, that's a fair delineation. The Power Platform tools, you can use them for greenfield. Pretty much every D365 application already has a fairly robust backend that's geared towards some set of business processes. Yeah.
I would say the biggest thing that the Power Platform exposes is the depth and breadth of Azure. So the platform itself is all Azure based. And it really speaks to that next level of abstraction that we as developers think about, which is, how do I remove the complexity of the underlying infrastructure and the complexity of building an application such that non-developers, non-people who have not gone through sort of the educational part of being a computer person, but still able to write that code or write an application that a line of business can then use. And again, sort of back to my passions, it, like I said, it really exposes the power of our cloud, that it's not just Azure and it's not just O365 or M365 or Teams or whatever. It's all of these tools that work together to provide that level of abstraction such that the businesses are sort of released to work on their own. They no longer need to come to the developer shop to really build an application. They can build that application within their own team, exercise that application, and they don't need the infrastructure. They don't need to talk about servers. They don't need to talk about databases and all of those other things. And it's really, it's one of those things that I love most about where the platform is now, that we do get exposed to the Azure underlying resources. You know, like I said initially, I came in from the on-prem world where, I was in charge of those servers and I had to keep them up to date and I had to do all of the things needed to keep the platform running. I don't have to do any of that anymore. And as a CRM person or as a Dynamics Power Platform person, that's a great thing.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, Michael. And just to kind of carry on that thought, if I'm a business unit of some enterprise out there, right, and I need to start building a new set of applications, at what point do I decide, or how do I decide, maybe I should do this using Power Platform, or maybe, this needs a traditional software development rigor, right? Maybe you need writing it in .NET or Java, Python, or whatever. I'm trying to figure out, like, how do you go through that decision matrix, right? To kind of come up with that, okay, Power Platform's the right way to go here.
So this is something that is especially relevant to our org at Microsoft. So for those that don't know, ISE is a very high code organization. We're a big engineering organization, very good developers. We trend high code. So this is something that our team explores constantly on our engagements, because the natural instinct is to go high code on anything we're building. Just to, hopefully I'm not misrepresenting us, but that's the group of engineers. That's what we do. So there are a couple scenarios where it does make sense to look at low code tools such as the Power Platform tools or some of the D365 development tools. The most common one we see is when we're trying to roll something out quickly. If we're on a tight timeline and we need kind of a straw man kind of interface, that's a place where specifically like Power Apps really excel. You can build a Power App for kind of demonstrative purposes really quickly. There's a specific example I wanted to mention on that particular scenario. We actually have somebody in ISC that in a previous life, well, in an ongoing life, responsible for a whole bunch of we'll call it mission critical inventory, and they were on a team that spun up a whole inventory management system in Power Apps and the backing data sources in like a weekend, which is like in my world coming from ERP, that's really fast. Like I have in D365 Finance a proper inventory system that it takes longer to customize than how fast this particular team built the whole thing. So that's one scenario is when we need speed. Another one we see a lot is if enterprises tend to have, because of history, monolithic apps. And again, in my world of ERP, that's no exception. That's an application with tens of modules. Maybe I've got a situation where we're a manufacturer, and we have a couple of things we need to do on the floor with people that have big gloves on, right? I'm not going to ask them to go get into a web client and click a couple of buttons on a production order. I'm going to give them some bigger buttons that they can hit with gloves and very specific workflow. That's a place where these tools also make sense because they're so tightly integrated with a lot of the applications that you would be wanting to carve that functionality out of. I'm going to pause there. I feel like I'm talking a lot. Michael, do you have any scenarios that come to mind where low code's specifically Power Platform comes into play in our world?
Yeah. So the biggest one that I see on the sort of from the dynamic side of the world. So these are customers that usually have the dynamic CRM implemented, and they see that user interface being able to give a broader view to their, expand it out within the enterprise. And so they'll build applications on top of that. And then very specific line of businesses, particularly I see finance and HR groups very interested in the platform because it allows them to build a small application for just their team to be able to do a specific business process or workflow that they need to get done. And again, it comes back to that speed and cost. So if I have a business a BA person who can work very easily in Excel and is very good with the Excel type of formula writing, they would be able to build an application very quickly to do a very specific function. If I need a really broad-based application to track, large things across the enterprise, typically, Power Platform, that's where we would start to look at what are the exact requirements. Is Power Platform the best for this, or are there Azure solutions that we can add to the Power Platform that will make that application possible? Things like, building an integration with an Azure function or an Azure service bus. Those types of integrations are possible on the platform, and it really is in those requirements where we'll see those types of things come out. But specific line of business applications, the platform is really built for that.
Those are very good points. And I often wonder, like, uh, how small or what size should the application be to say this makes sense in Power Platform, right? At some point you got to say, like, I'm not going to build my entire e-commerce suite around Power Platform. And maybe you do. I just don't know, right? So I just want to kind of understand, like, what should be I guess, the scope of your application to say, hey, this is something we can't, or is it possible for a bunch of developers to get together and build like everything in Power Platform? Let's put it that way.
I'm going to get really specific in my response on that. I have a specific example of mine that kind of demonstrates this. So we many years ago, pre my role at Microsoft, built a EDI solution. Now I don't know if this is defensible. So for the audience, you may hear this and go, that's a crazy thing to do him. But we built an EDI solution in Logic Apps, which for those that don't know, in the Power Platform, there's an almost identical interface called Power Automate, previously known as Flow. So that's why I'm bringing it's the comparable example. We had a lot of, as you may imagine, in an EDI solution, we had a lot of control flow in that Logic app. I would say, became almost unmanageable in terms of trying to build that integration visually with a bunch of switches and conditions and things that I'm like scrolling around a canvas to try and resolve, versus had we done that in code, in my opinion, high code, it would have been more readable. So that's kind of like a hindsight example, but the point I'm getting at is if you're looking at something that's going to have like a lot of control flow or a lot of state that you need to define in a custom fashion, something where you're going to be managing a lot of kind of non-standard things in your development. And I say a lot, that's not very specific. That's to me kind of like the thing that I keep in the back of my mind when we're looking at, can we do this least code, low code versus traditional development, is is it going to be complex? I'm kind of throwing your question back, but that's
a good point.
If you can imagine the visual canvas, and
Yeah.
you're thinking about a lot of scroll bars, you probably need to go high code. I guess that's my short answer.
And by extension to that, if you have, let's say, 10 developers working on the same solution, I'm guessing that's also going to be complicated to do with Power Apps, right? I mean, I don't know how it works if multiple developers have the same Power App open, or the same page or the module or whatever open. How that, obviously with the traditional programming languages, we can strip it down to a number of smaller pieces and have them all worked on parallel, versus that even possible in Power Apps? I guess that's the other thing.
Yeah, I think that's been, you're calling out a fair deficiency that I would say is increasingly becoming historical. There are of late, within like the past year, a lot of new kind of features being added and toolkits being built around that exact problem. Like if how do I match a team that is traditionally, there's a lot of churn to this kind of newer framework. I know that we've got pipelines now within the Power Platform, which is super helpful for build validation across a larger team. There's a toolkit, Michael, maybe you can remember it. There's a toolkit that helps a lot with this too. One of our teams here at Microsoft has produced, and I can't remember the name of it.
So does the CI/CD kind of process
Yeah,
when you check
yeah,
the
it's
code
geared
of your
specifically toward
power apps?
exactly. And maybe we can after
We can
the episode
we
wraps
can
here,
we
we
can
can
put
drop
it
a
in the
link.
show notes. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that's not a problem. Yep.
Or
I think that helps.
is it the ALM accelerator that
Yes,
you're
that's what I'm
thinking
thinking
about?
of. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, we'll drop a link for anybody looking at this after the fact. We'll hopefully get a link in there um, for that tool, the accelerator. Yeah.
And
Okay.
so I would also say that it depends on what it is that you're doing on the platform, in terms of the number of developers that you can integrate into building out what it is that you need. So in a previous life, we did have 10 developers doing a CRM implementation, and there are ways that we made that happen so that it was possible. But the true power of the platform comes in that I don't necessarily need 10 developers to build this application and get it working for my group. And that is definitely a delineation in the platform as you're gathering out those
Mm-hmm.
requirements. If it's clear that you're building a large scale application, at that point you may not consider the platform at that point. But typically, if it's one, two, three people within a line of business and they have something very specific in mind, the platform provides them with the ability to get that out the door and exercised very quickly to determine whether or not it's what they actually are looking for. And so we are building a lot of tools around that multi-developer experience. There are parts of the platform that lend itself better to a multi-developer experience. Um, when we speak specifically of power apps like a Canvas app, that is less about a multi-developer experience. When we get into model-driven apps and the web-based experience, the Power Pages, it lends itself better to a multi-developer experience. And in addition, typically when you get into those scenarios, you do have that mix of high code and low code. So there are business processes that you will implement in the platform that are actually C# code. And then the UI that sits on top of that is the low code side, that sort of thing.
Got it.
So it does provide both of those experiences. But as Ian said, it's a work in progress. We are definitely getting much better at it. And to our product group's credit, they are really doing a nice job of filling in the body of the platform, so to speak. We have a good sort of stick figure, and now they're adding the muscle and all of that to it.
I want to interject
Mm.
maybe the most controversial thing I'll say on that note, which is that Sujit, I like talking about the history of these things, probably too much, but there's, in my opinion, this is not me representing Microsoft. I think some of that, what Michael's talking about, where we're kind of adding these things a little bit later these weren't there at the conception of the products. It's because of who the original target audience was, which is Michael was getting at. These tools, for the most part, were geared at citizen devs and individual citizen devs that had one business problem that they were solving for themselves or maybe their team. And what has happened since these things kind of exploded on the market is companies are building broad, big solutions with these tools and are starting to have bigger teams. And that's when you start thinking about, well, hold on, what does our ILM look like? What does our CI/CD process look like? And so I think the product development kind of matches that timeline of what it's actually been doing out there in the wild. There, spicy thoughts shared.
Yeah. No, I think that's very good thoughts. As a matter of fact, I wanted to dig into the deployment and the CCD part. What are some of the options? Like, big companies obviously they like to put things into Azure as part of a pipeline in part of an organized way. So, two quick questions. Is there like a deployment story here? And second is, what's the controls they have to secure these things in Azure, right? Like to make sure that, hey, I'm using this stuff in Azure. Anything that goes in Azure, it raises red flags with most enterprise architects out there. And so, do they have something that they can control and manage in that space?
I might get very specific again here. I can answer that from the lens of the ERP products. I think that's where I have probably the most relevant knowledge. So we're in the middle of a shift actually on at least the pre-production side of that story. Historically, many of the resources in the D365 finance space were directly deployed to a customer's Azure subscription, which Suji, as you mentioned, cautious Azure admins are always a little perturbed when there's some automated generation there. I will say that the way that the product group built the resource deployment tools specifically for ERP was pretty good. Like you have a standalone system that would deploy a resource group for your development VMs. There was a little bit that we always had to do around security on that front by hand. We are mid-evolution on that front to a true service offering, where at least for the pre-production infrastructure, you're not necessarily going to have any of that in your subscription anymore. It's all managed by Microsoft. And that includes even the cloud dev instances specifically for ERP. So that's, I think, one place where the product group was kind of listening to customers that were worried about the security vulnerabilities, worried about the cost. I mean, these resources are not cheap, and changed it to a kind of a more streamlined infrastructure model, but also costing model, really. I mean, I'm sure you've had previous guests talk about our fund licensing stories here at Microsoft. So that makes it easier too. But that's one specific kind of example. Michael, I don't know if you wanted to talk about kind of in the rest of the BizApp suite, how any other interesting places.
So I think that one of the things that the product group has done a superior job in, at least on the CE and the platform side, is abstracting the best practices in Azure away from the customer. So we have implemented our infrastructure in Azure, and our product group has done so with an eye towards what are our best security practices. How are those resources that we now manage secured for our customer? And then what areas can we then expose additional functionality to increase the security of the customer? So in that space, things like customer managed keys. So underneath the covers in the database, there's an encryption key. We now allow our customers to manage those for themselves. We have the ability to put in um, uh, um, we used to call them group policies, but on the cloud side in Azure, I forget the name of them, but we allow IP address specification. So we can say for this website, only allow this set of IPs to actually access the web or the application itself. We have integrated the web application firewall that you had talked about initially. So we have added in those types of security mechanisms on top of implementing Azure in the most secure practices that we can. Is it perfect? Definitely not. We do our best to make it that way. But as anything in IT, we're learning as we go along. And but I do have to give out a shout to our product group in that they have really taken, when we move to the cloud, Charles, Lamana, and James, when they initially took over, they went forward with this idea of Azure first, build it in Azure, use the tools that we have and the best practices that we know in the cloud, such that our customer doesn't have to worry about those things. And they've done a superior job at that.
That's very great to hear. Thank you, Michael and Ian. So I want to just pivot, if I can, to the developer story for the high code, right? We've talked about low code a bit, but I'm curious to hear about the high code, right? Because at least I know that the high code may not be what people expect. But Ian, maybe you can give us a flavor for what high code means in terms of D365 development.
Yeah, and I hope I'm not spilling the beans here, but so Sujit mentioned personal experience. He and I worked on a project where he got to live this firsthand, so he's got some knowledge here as well. So again, so when we talk about high code, Michael mentioned that in most spaces across the biz apps, Microsoft's biz apps, there are places for high code still. There's places where it kind of plugs in. One application where there's a lot of high code still is the one I specialize in, which is D365 Finance. There's a lot of interesting historical reasons for that. The code base is quite large. That's probably one of the biggest reasons. It's also not super compatible with just porting right over to like Power Effects or something. So that the experience I alluded to historically was you had a one box where for development. So basically a canned VM from a library that had all of the kind of scripted resources ready to go for you in Azure. The Visual Studio instance has some plugins. There's a bunch of local services on that box that need to be running for your development to work. And that actually itself was an innovation compared to what we had previously. So for those of us in the X++ dev space, which is the language we customized D365 Finance with, it was really exciting to have something where it's like, oh, it's just canned. I can just work with this. And but that the world moved forward. Other development experiences have become a lot more modular and portable with like package managers and configuration managers and all the things that make it that we can develop wherever we want. And very recently in our world, the D365 product group has kind of moved the X++ dev experience forward to that more of that model. So now you deploy basically a cloud service for your dev instance to connect to. And now you can set up Visual Studio locally with some plugins, connect to that cloud instance for you to validate your changes against of D365 Finance. And you no longer need this kind of rigid canned infrastructure. So that's
Ian, I have to stop you there. You mentioned X++ like it's everyone would know about it, right?
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
So let's just take a minute to explain what X++ is, because I know I had to figure it out.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a good call out. So it is X++ is a domain specific language that we use. It's got, I won't go too much into the history, although I want to. It's got a decent history. It's about as old as the .NET kind of world. Looks a lot like C#. Kind of developed in its own fork. It's its own historical thing. But anybody that's I would argue anybody that's done C# development would be relatively comfortable looking at X++ code. There's some like patterns that because it is domain specific, there are some patterns that it's kind of tuned for more in the ERP space. But that's the very high code experience that ERP devs are used to is building things in X++.
And that's what that Visual Studio gives you, right? It gives you an X++ kind of development environment,
right?
Kind of side to side with the .NET code that you might have to build to add on, because it does work very well with .NET if I remember.
Yes.
And then that kind of helps you, like if you're right, for a .NET developer, X++ should be easier for you to consume. It still has its own little nuances and syntaxes and ways of working. It does work with a very specific model, like that you have to use and understand and get to like. But yeah, I mean that definitely was a big learning experience for me coming into that project with you, Ian. So what So now we know that we could use X++ to kind of customize, build extensions for, let's say, to D365, or create new user experiences if that's necessary, etc. Uh, what are the like, as a developer, like what are some of the tools they would have to use to, let's say, integrate with their source control system? Or developers, we talk of high code, that's what they think of, right? What's my CI/CD story? What's my source control story? Where are we with all of that? Like, how does that work with X++ and D365?
Yeah, that's an interest. So again, in the specific world of X++, there's been this kind of interesting history where um, we went all in on TFVC for version control. I'll say that, and there has been a lot of recent kind of fervor around Git. Again, kind of trying to catch up to the rest of the developer world. And so we've actually, I think hopefully we can get some links for this too. We've done some work in-house to help our customers that are interested in getting over to Git to kind of match the rest of their enterprise code management. We've released some guidance from ISC and then kind of broader Microsoft around how customers would want to do that. There's some, I won't bore your whole audience with like the technical nuances of why it's kind of hard. But there are some challenges around setting up kind of modern version control for the canned architecture for X++ that I was alluding to earlier. Outside of ERP development, outside of X++ development, it's actually a lot more flexible. And some of the tools that Michael and I were talking about earlier, some of these kits that have been built in-house to work with the Power Platform development space, they assume Git, they assume modern version control tools. I think some of them even come with CI/CD templates. I should mention our X++ guidance has CI/CD templates as well. So it's pretty well covered. It's all kind of the biz apps world getting away from the cowboy coders days of old. We're definitely well on our way to, I would say, stability on that front. So, yeah.
And then what's the I guess the combination of X++ and Power Apps or Power Platform language? Is that a language? I don't know if I should be calling it a specific language, the Power Platform system.
Power Effects. Most Power
Power
Platforms
Effects.
have Power Effects. Yep.
Okay, so if you take Power Effects and C X++, or even .NET for that matter, is there like a synergy between these three languages now, as from a developer perspective?
From a
Like,
yes,
I think Michael mentioned you could combine a .NET with the Power Apps, right? I think where does X++ fit in that? Like in Power Apps, is that there is also an integration story there too, or are they two completely different systems that can only talk to each other via the back end?
From a development perspective, it's a pretty light interface. There's an increasing amount of native functionality in D365 Finance to support the integration of Power Platform tools. There's actually a front-end interface for embedding Power Apps themselves. Going in the other direction, it's not quite as compatible. But you did jog my memory on something that maybe is interesting here, which is that from a delivery perspective, the different tool sets are kind of converging. And so I don't think it would be unreasonable for us to say that in the medium future, we can expect development for Power Platform, Power Apps, flows, D365 sales development, D365 finance development to be able to be packaged in one deployable. So you have kind of this one pane situation of you have a good idea of what your whole state looks like from a code perspective, from a deliverable perspective. Yeah,
that's important. Yeah, that's very important. Excellent. No, I think this is really good. And so just to go back to the Power Platform world, you mentioned like there's Power Apps for building simple apps, Power Automate, which is more like workflow style background applications, right? They don't have a UI. There is Power BI, which is I think everybody knows about that. I did see briefly Power virtual agents for chatbots. Is that becoming popular these days? How's that going? And then you mentioned Power. I think Michael mentioned Power Pages. which seems to be also new in my book, at least.
Yeah, Power Virtual Agents, maybe the second most controversial thing I'm going to say. This everybody wants to talk about AI, right? And PVA integrates some cool AI functionality, and so it is. We do on our team specifically get a lot of inquiries around PVA. There's this. I'll just highlight one feature quickly here that I think is probably why we got so many calls. There's this notion of generative answers in PV. So anybody that's interacted with these bots historically knows they're kind of painful, right? Like they're pretty rigid. It's like, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Can you ask it a different way? There is a feature in PVA now where it's been there for a minute. It's actually using one of the AI services in Azure to parse the question and get a response based on the data sets that you've configured it to look at. And it's pretty good. You have, I would say, citizen dev level tuning capabilities around content moderation and like the style of the response that you get. Anyways, that's I'm off on a little bit of a tangent, but that is, yes, it's a popular product. And I think it's specifically because of some of these AI features that people are really interested in seeing if they can use it to solve some in-house and customer service problems efficiently. Power Pages is maybe this, I would say, the second highest code remaining of the biz apps. It's got a good kind of initial design interface for what you want your public facing sites to look like. But as far as like the under the hood work of prettifying it and doing work with the website, that tends to be, at least in the projects we've seen, high code. Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Power Pages, just historically, came into the platform as an outside. We purchased the company and brought them in, and it really provides that third type of application interface. So we have the model-driven apps and the Canvas apps, and Power Pages really provides that third interface through a website. And as Ian said, out of the box, it really can be a low code type of website. However, if you need it to do more complex things, that's where you get into more of the high code where you're using your JavaScript and your HTML or TypeScript, if that's your chosen language. And it still is sort of similar to X++ or the ERP side, probably the highest code necessary. So you really do need to. JavaScript is extremely helpful, the knowledge of it, when you get into the Power Pages side.
That's awesome. Great. No, thanks so much. This has been a real eye-opener in terms of all of the various application and SaaS offerings that we have in Azure to help both our developers as well as our business community. Is there anything else you want to say in closing? Things that maybe you guys are working on, or what we could come to expect soon? And of course, we know we're going to get some links from you guys, and we'll put it in the show notes with all of the information you've just spoken about.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank you for inviting us. This has been very fun. Big fan of the show. For what is a long time listener, first time caller. Yeah, there is one thing real quick that we wanted to throw in. Our team is working on what will eventually be what is an open source Terraform provider for managing the infrastructure side of a lot of the applications that we talked about here. So our goal is kind of full breadth on the biz apps space. The reason this kind of hasn't happened historically and exists now, I mentioned kind of upfront that there's been this kind of consolidation effort across the business applications to make them more kind of compatible, make the APIs that we use to manage them more consistent. We've kind of reached an inflection point on that. And so our team has kind of recognized that opportunity, and we're building a tool that should, hopefully for listeners of this episode, already be public by the time, well, I know this goes up quick. We'll throw a link. We'll give Sujit a link. It's called the Power Platform Terraform Provider. I don't know if that's going to be the final name, but you can use it to manage the state of your biz apps through Terraform, declarative Terraform definitions, rather than hitting APIs individually or scripting things off to the side. You don't need to care about that. That's the beauty of Terraform for those who aren't familiar. So quick plug on that, the Terraform Power Platform Terraform provider. We will have a repo up publicly, hopefully in the next little bit here.
I would also throw
Awesome.
in a plug for the Fusion Ops playbook, where we publish a lot of the best practices and learnings that we've talked about here on the platform. That is also a public Git repo out there, that we'll throw a link out for as well.
That would be very helpful. Thank you, Michael and Ian. All right. Well, great chatting with you guys. This has been a lovely, catch up on all the other things. Like, we get so focused on Azure and things, we forget there's this whole other system that also is in Azure that we should inform our listeners about. And I really thank you for doing a great job on that. Well, we'll look forward to hearing from you guys sometime in the future on other updates.
Thank you.
Thank you.